Well, the Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz is in Washington right now, holding talks with the US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Let's go to Washington, D.C. Our senior US correspondent Mike Wagenheim is there. So, Mike, what's happening? Is the Biden administration still hopeful that the JCPOA can be salvaged?
They've been hopeful from day one. I think that hope is fading at this point. And even though several diplomats involved in the negotiations in Vienna today called the talks constructive, they only lasted an hour. Everybody seems to still kind of be stuck around their red lines and not willing to budge at this point, and unsure what another round or two of talks is going to look like. The Iranians came out of the negotiations basically saying that their point of view in terms of their demand for the Americans to lift all sanctions, they're not budging from it, is basically what they said at the end of talks today in Vienna. So the Americans are starting to look elsewhere. As Jonathan Regev mentioned, reports coming out of Washington that Israeli and American officials this week in all quarters are talking about potential military exercises to get ready for, again, a potential strike on Iranian nuclear facilities if diplomacy should fail. It's what the Israelis have been saying all along. You've got to have a plan B in place. The Israelis had told the Americans from the start that Iran was not negotiating in good faith. It seems the Americans are starting to come around to that point of view at this particular time. And right now at the Pentagon behind me, talks ongoing between Secretary Austin and Defense Minister Gantz as to what exactly comes next and how the Americans and the Israelis can move forward together in terms of planning for a potential military operation vis-a-vis the Iranian nuclear threat.
Mike, thanks very much indeed. Mike Wagenheim there over in Washington, D.C. as those talks between the Israeli Defense Secretary and his American counterpart continue. Over in Washington, well, joining us here in the studio, Major General Eitan Dangot is the former military secretary to 3 ministers of defense here in Israel and is now senior research fellow at the Miriam Institute. Thank you for being with us. So they say it would be for a worst-case scenario. Do you think that the US and Israel are right now talking about a potential military strike on Iran?
I think that much more than in the last weeks, you see that Israel and the United States are closing a gap, officially gap, that was discussed, that the United States is not listening to Israel, and it was looking like there is a tense event between them. But I think that the recent meetings are showing what is very important to Israel, and I think also for the United States. United States is the main important foreign country to Israel in the Middle East. And you cannot go to such discussions with all our said about it in Vienna without having other options, because the Iranian already declared, and you see after 7 meetings nothing has changed. The Iranian declared they demand to delete all the sanctions, and on the other hand it looks like they're not giving anything and they're moving ahead and more. What Israel is doing, after maybe a gap that Israel has to ask itself why it has to be in the last 2-3 years without any kind of moving ahead with these issues, that Israel is talking more and more about the plan B. And I would like to raise a plan between A and B, plan C. It means nothing can be proved that Israel and the United States will train, for example, on attacking inside Iran. You can attack also military targets of Iran in other countries which are giving Iran the self-meaning or the way of looking that they are strong enough to continue with their move ahead in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq.
All right, so, but we're talking about curbing the nuclear program here.
Yeah, I know,
specifically
but when you combine
strikes on nuclear facilities.
Yes, but when you combine a military targets of missiles, rockets, nuclear facilities, it means that you can give Iranian steps that Iran will sit in another way in Vienna, because I'm not believe the United States will leave the policy, the talks, and will try to achieve. But what is discussed now is really important. It has been discussed in the past.
So is this just a negotiating tactic? tactic then? Is this just designed to ramp up the pressure?
No, I think it's seriously the step that Israel sent, Minister Gantz and the head of the Mossad United States, shows a serious way of showing, briefing, sharing ideas about what to attack and what to achieve. And I think it's a new atmosphere that we are facing, a stage of a new atmosphere that have to influence the discussions in Vienna as well.
But there's very little appetite in the United States for any kind of military intervention in the Middle East. A poll out today shows that half of Israelis would approve military strikes on Iran without US approval. Is Israel going to go it alone?
I think that it is not the priority of Israel. But if Israel, after analyze the situation, will come to a conclusion that it stay alone and it must do things for defend Israel against the main threat of Israel's existence in the future, Israel has to have plans to do it. I'm not coming and saying that we will destroy all the nuclear plan, but Israel has capacities and have the opportunities to attack. And we are not discussing only about program of attack. We're discussing in the United States in issues of arsenal of weapon systems, intelligence sharing, and other things that will help both sides.